I'll get started. So tonight's session is land assessment, assessing land values, principles, and methods. And I'm just showing the 5 sessions so that you're aware of what's coming up. And every Monday there's a session for in the month of August. So you can see the upcoming 3 sessions also in addition to tonight's, which I've colored. Now, I'm giving you my background just for reference. This evening, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience in British Columbia from 1975 to 1986. And you'll find that kind of some interest. So tonight's session is going to have 3 parts to it. We're going to start off with the best source of public revenue, kind of talking about revenue sources. I'm going to give then and good government, and I'm going to be giving some examples from British Columbia. And then the third part is going to be on assessment policy and administration and how it varies from state to state, because each state has kind of different policies and administrative procedures. This course is, of course, sponsored by the Henry George School, and I'm a supporter of the social philosophy and economic reforms that Henry George advocated. In particular, association, inequality is the law of human progress. And second, to abolish all taxation save that upon land values. So I'm going to first just review what we covered last week at session 1. We talked about the nature of land, and it's the entire material universe. We talked about the uniqueness of land, that land is fixed in supply, that land is immobile, and that land is indispensable, needed at all times. Land rent was what we decided was the price that's paid annually for the use of the site. And that location, we all want to use the best location that we can to get the best advantages that we can make of the land. And then finally, we talked about the property tax and the role of the assessor in lesson 1. So I've made from the beginning that land rent is the best source of public revenue. That rent is a primary source of public revenue, and that collecting land rent could reduce taxes on wages, buildings, workers, producers, merchants, and enhance the wealth of all people, just as Henry George advocated. Why collect land rent? Well, basically, as we discovered last time, land rent is created by the community, and land rent belongs to the community. Land rent is adequate to fund all public purposes. So just talking a little bit more about community values. The full community, along with nature, creates land value and secures its exclusive use. The community adds to the market value of land, making improvements which increase the demand for land. And the collection of land rent for public revenue returns this value to the community that created it. So talking about a competent city government, the major functions of a competent city government are to provide good community services by collecting the land rent created within the community to ensure that the efficient use of land and equal opportunities, and there are equal opportunities for all citizens. Transportation is a very important function of government, which would facilitate the creation of a compact city where people can easily find the facilities that they require for education, commerce, religion, recreation. Good land use with the freedom of individuals to achieve the highest and best use of land would ensure a desirable community. I'm going to quote from Adam Smith. In the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith suggested that any tax should be a charge for services which are more efficiently performed by the community than by individual efforts. He postulated 4 principles of taxation, which are sources of revenue, which the sources of revenue should meet. So the first one is that public revenue should be light on the production of wealth and does not impede or reduce production. Well, when you tax land or secure revenue from land, you're actually enhancing production because you're reducing the speculation in land that would impede production. So the land fits that category of being light on production straight ahead. 2, cheap to collect, requiring few collectors and easy to understand. If you think about the sales tax, it requires virtually everything you do, every transaction you make has a sales tax related to it, and the income taxes and the army it takes to collect those. The land tax fits very well into this second category. It is cheap to collect and it's easy to understand. It's what we're doing on this course. Third, that it's certain, can't be avoided. Little opportunity for corruption and provides adequate revenue. Well, it is certain and it can't be avoided because land simply cannot get up and leave. If you increase the taxes on corporations or individuals, they can get up and leave. But when you put that tax on land, it cannot get up and leave. And there's little opportunity for corruption because if you are corrupt, it's called right out. Everyone can see it. It's hard to hide corruption, when you're dealing with land revenue. And as I'm proving throughout these series that we're on, there is adequate revenue to fund all of the needs of the community. The fourth then function is that it's equitable and fair. There's a payment for benefits received. It's impartial and just. Again, land meets this requirement. It's directly a payment for the benefits that are provided by the community. It is impartial and it is just. So land rent is the only public revenue source that meets all of these criteria. It's been argued that the difficulty of accurate assessments and fair land value assessment renders land valuation taxation unsuitable. Some claim that there's an inadequate number of land sales. However, this is due to misunderstanding and misconceptions about land assessment that we're going to be addressing throughout this paper. In particular, I found that valuing land was the least difficult part of making a property assessment. In addition to vacant land sales that you also have tear down sales, properties that are sold where the buyer is planning on tearing it down. And in fact, every improved property sale includes a sale of land. By removing the building value portion, the land sale is apparent, which is what this paper will demonstrate. And land values are consistent within a neighborhood, except for obvious differences for which adjustments can be made. And we'll be showing that later on also, how the neighborhoods, are a way of kind of coming up with what is typical and in a neighborhood, and then making adjustments for the differences. So I'm going to use British Columbia as an example tonight. And I think you'll find it kind of interesting. British Columbia is an example of good government and good assessment practices. The land area of British Columbia is 364,000 square miles. That land area would be equivalent to Texas plus New Mexico plus Arizona added together. And the number of properties in British Columbia are 2,044,000. British Columbia has 104 cities and rural areas in total to assess. The total assessed value of the property in British Columbia today is $2 trillion. And land is greater than 1/2 of that, which means the land is worth more than $1 trillion. British Columbia on the map, you can see that it sits directly north of the state of Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And the Rocky Mountains run right through the eastern part of the province of British Columbia, and the Cascade or the Coast Mountains are along the coast. There's 140 cities and rural areas, and you can see some of them on there. The capital is Victoria, British Columbia. That shows you geographically what it looks like. There's a lot of mountains and natural things in British Columbia. Over time, in British Columbia, each city had created its own separate organization for assessing using individual assessment criteria. And as a result, due to a lack of standard valuation methods, assessments were frequently challenged and often difficult to defend. I'm talking about back in the 60s and 60s during that period. Alarmed with the rising incidence of serious equity grievances and pressures by property owners and public sectors, government was compelled to implement new and improved systems for British Columbia. In addition to that, assessments had been frozen in British Columbia for 30 years. So the BC government wanted to improve the property assessment and capture a greater portion of revenue from land and natural resources. So in 1973, I offered my services as a consultant to make recommendations for improving the assessment function in the province of British Columbia. And I was given a 1-year contract. This is the Parliament buildings in downtown Victoria on Victoria Harbor. So during that period, I studied it along with other people that were in the assessment field. And then we made recommendations to an all-party committee of the provincial legislature and conducted a comprehensive study. And we recommended a province-wide assessment authority to replace all the city assessors and be independent of the local taxing function, and to make annual reassessment of land and improvements separately made at market value to achieve equity in real property taxation. So in 1975, the government had adopted the recommendations that we had made. And fortunately, I was appointed as the assessment commissioner and the chief executive officer. And I stayed in that position for 11 years until 1986. The records of all of the existing city assessment units were consolidated into a single database. And the staff size had originally been about 850 city employees, but we offered them jobs, and we wound up with 690 staff members. And what's kind of interesting is that over the period of time, over the 45 years since this was first established in 1974, 75, that staff size has not really increased. That's the same number today, even though the population and the number of properties have, more than quadrupled over that time. So when the authority was set up, we set up new systems for the data processing, for mapping, for the assessment roll production, for statutory reports, for appraisal systems, office systems. And success was achieved by simplifying the handling of property transfers, expanding the training programs, creating appraisal manuals, expanding technical support, and developing mass land and property valuation systems. The objectives that we had were to capture more land rent as a plentiful source of public revenue, and to reduce taxes on buildings, workers, homeowners, producers, and merchants, and provide a province-wide student benefit and enhance the wealth of all people. By student benefit, at the time that the authority was set up, the assessing had been done by each city, and the school district that was in the city, if it was a wealthy city like Vancouver, they had a pretty large sum of money to produce good quality education facilities, but poorer communities that had little in terms of commercial development had a hard time providing students with adequate benefits. So one of the first laws that was passed after the assessment authority was created was coming up with a province-wide student benefit that would be raised across the province and then distributed per student as opposed to by the community itself. And this also enabled us to collect for the first time large sums of money from all the natural resource landowners, the forest companies, the coal miners, and all the other groups that had vast amounts of land values that had not been adequately taxed and to benefit the education system. So the result was a lot of legislation that once this assessment authority was going and working properly, that benefited all the people in the community. So in 2021, the British Columbia assessment has been in business now for 47 years. And British Columbia assessment has set the standard for updating assessed values annually. It is considered the most efficient assessment organization in the world. Of course, I would say that, but that's also the view of the International Association of Assessing Officers and virtually the leaders of the assessment field worldwide. And by the way, British Columbia was instrumental in going to many countries that sought their expertise in setting up the assessment function for their countries. So in 2017, $7.9 billion were collected in property tax revenue, of which $4 billion was for land generated for the communities to provide the benefit for all British Columbia people. And the population now in 2021 is estimated to be 5.1 million people. And land is assessed value for all parcels, and we also assess the value of all the improved parcels. And the total value of all real estate in the province is assessed at $2 trillion. That's the first part of of what we're covering tonight. And the second part I'm going to get into now. I guess what I'll do is I'll just do a break at this point. If there's any questions about what I've just talked about, I'll answer those. And then we'll go into the second part, which is on the second part, I'm going to be showing a lot of maps that kind of show the variance from one one state to another about how the property tax is administered. And you'll be able to kind of look at your own states or your own regions to see how they differ from other places. And it is kind of interesting because the tax policies and administration's trends are different in the various states. And you'll find this kind of interesting. But if there are any questions about the first subjects I've just covered, I'd be happy to answer them at this point. If not, we'll move on. I see two hands up there. Lars, did you have a question? By the way, you have to unmute yourself before you talk, Lars. Okay, unmute yourself. Ibrahima, can you unmute him? Okay, there you are.
There we go. Yeah, it says host. Yeah, so my question is about Vancouver. So does Vancouver, I've heard that there's really, really, really high housing prices in Vancouver. I don't live there. Am I wrong? Or does Vancouver have a different property assessment policy from British Columbia? How does it all work? Do you know anything about Vancouver in specific?
Yes, my question. That's a very good question. And as I've stated before, and I'll be stating throughout this whole series, the value of land value taxation depends upon the amount of land value that you collect as revenue. And in most cities of the world, particularly the United States and Canada, we're collecting very little of the rental value of land. For example, in Vancouver, the amount of land revenue collected is less than 1%. It's probably about 3/4 or less of 1% of the land value, which means that the majority of land rent is uncollected and is put in the pockets of landowners who just jack the prices up and sell at higher prices and keep the land out of use, which means that they can get even higher prices. And so Vancouver, while being set up to be one of the best possible examples of how this would work, has proven to be one of the worst examples because they collect so little of the revenue from land that they should be. And this is true not only of Vancouver, it's not only true of British Columbia, it's true worldwide, that we see that so little of the land rent is being collected. And I do have a map that I showed last time that there are some places which collect more, and those places tend to do better, such as Vermont, New Hampshire, for example, and a few other places that are collecting a larger amount of land revenue. Let's go on to another question. Yanis, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Ted. I was wondering if the assessment is dynamic. In other words, if rents collected during the year, do they add to the land value? How is that working with the assessment and what the city considers as land value?
Okay, in British Columbia, all land is reassessed once a year. And in most jurisdictions, it's assessed periodically. And I'll have one chart I'm going to show you. They typically are assessed every either 1 year or every second year or third year or fourth year or fifth year. So in British Columbia, it's every year that they assess land value, but it's only once during the year. There is an assessment date, July 1st, and they set the values, and then there's a period of appeal. And property owners have the right then to check it and check their values as of that time. But again, most jurisdictions do not assess value every year, and they certainly don't assess it on a more than 1 year basis. Many of them only do it every 3 or 4 years. Marty Rowland, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So my question had to do with cities that have properties that are maybe underassessed or not collected. Is there ever, in your experience, a case where a government unit has used eminent domain to take property away so that the value can be recovered by the community?
eminent domain is used for the purpose of making public improvements, not to enforce the property tax. So you know, property taxes based upon market value should be the incentive that would provide the revenue needed and encourage the property owner to use his property either correctly or to sell it to someone who would. The problem we have is that most jurisdictions are not collecting most or all of the rental value of land. So many property owners are basically being subsidized for squatting on the property, not making it available, and being basically a public nuisance, not using the property or not allowing others to use the property correctly. So that's a big problem. The charts I'm going to be showing, I think, are going to answer a lot of these questions, because it does show that in some jurisdictions how trends different and how some communities are doing things differently than others. I don't know, Marty, does that answer your question, or did you have another question?
That was good. Appreciate it.
Okay. All right, I think we'll go on then to the second part. This is the second part now is going to be the charts that I'm going to show you. And the charts are going to show the 50 states plus Washington, D.C. So it's 51 statewide jurisdictions and the 10 provinces of Canada and 3 territories of Canada. And this report was done for the International Association of Assessing Officers. And I want to explain that the IAAO is a nonprofit educational and research association. It's a professional membership of government assessment officials and others that are interested in the administration of the property tax. And it was founded in 1934. It has a membership of more than 7,000 members. I've been a member since I first had my first assessing job in 1966. So I've been an active part of that organization for a long time. This series of slides that I'm going to be showing was prepared for a conference held in December 25th of 2018. And it's pretty interesting what they've done. They did prior studies. They had studies done in 2012 and 2009, but this in the 1970s. But this one is now the most recent one that was done. It was started in 2017 and completed in 2018. And it's to provide a comprehensive description of property tax assessment policies and practices in Canada and the United States. A valuable resource for policymakers and practitioners evaluating and improving laws and administration in their own jurisdictions. These are the kind of subjects we're going to be looking at in the slides, and we'll go by one and show you what the differences are. They used a monkey survey and sent out the survey to all the states and provinces. And they used an Ezra ArcGIS to actually show the results on maps. So the responses they got, 49 of the 51 states responded, and 11 of the 13 Canadian provinces and territories responded. And those that didn't respond, they had information from prior years for Alabama, New Jersey, and Yukon Territory. So the first subject is central agency staffing and roles in assessment. And this shows, looking at both the United States and Canada, how large the state staff is. Now, there's a big difference between Canada and the United States, because in Canada, all of the provinces and territories are managed and operated province-wide and assessed province-wide. Whereas in the United States, typically the assessments are done at the county level, or in some cases, the city level. And the state level is to oversee what's being done and to also to provide some central assessment valuation knowledge. Actually, many of the states actually do assessment of pipelines and those types of things that they want to see uniform throughout the state and throughout the country as much as possible. So this first chart shows the size of the statewide organization. And you can see that the largest organizations are all in Canada, and in particular, Ontario and Quebec have very large staffs. Also, British Columbia in Canada has a fairly large staff, in Montana in the United States. And you can see by the colors there on the left, going from red down to the bright green ones are very small staff size. Okay, going to the next one. What is the role of the statewide agency in terms of education and credentialing of the appraisers? In terms of education, green is yes and red is no, and yellow is kind of something, else. So you can see that in most of the states, the state agency is providing education, but in some states or in some districts, they have other forms of getting educational accomplishments. And then in terms of credentialing, you see that in green is yes and red is no, and that credentialing is not done as much as education, because credentialing in some states is handled by other organizations such as the International Association of Assessing Officers, for example. Now, looking at the next slides, assessment of special property versus assessment of all property. And yes is green, and red is no, and yellow is not applicable. So you can see that in terms of valuing special types of properties, and these would include things like pipelines and railroads and those types of things, many of the states are providing this kind of service to the local county jurisdictions. Then in terms of the places where assess all property, again, now green is yes and red is no. You'll see that in the United States, it's mainly no, whereas in Canada, it's mainly yes. So there's the differences. You do see that Montana and a few other states where they do have centralized assessment in the United States. Okay, the next we have equalization studies and sale ratio studies. Now, sale ratio study, we'll start with that. Green means yes and red means no. The sale ratio study is where you look at the sale price that occurs during the year and you compare it to the assessment. And if it's a perfect match, it winds up being 1. But if it's under assessed, it will be like 0.90%. Or if it's over assessed, it would be like maybe 110%. So this sale ratio is pretty much done in most of the jurisdictions by the state type or provincial level. And in some cases, though, it's not done by the state level. So it does show that there are very commonly found sale ratio studies in all of Canada and the United States. In terms of equalization studies, that's where adjustments are made based upon a state study to equalize assessment from one jurisdiction to another. And that could be like from one county to another or one city to another, based on sales ratio studies, so that there's an equalization so that people in classes of properties are being treated the same way statewide by making adjustments so that they're not being overburdened because higher assessments in one county versus another county. On the next slide is compelling reassessment and then audits. In terms of compelling reassessments, green is yes and red is no. And in terms of audits, green is yes and red is no. And you'll see that compelling reassessments is not that common, although it is more common in the United States. That being because the state function, basically is then wanting to ensure that it's correct. Whereas in Canada, most of the provinces are doing the assessments themselves. So there's not a need for a compelling reassessment. And in terms of the performance audits, again, green being yes, red no. And you can see that the performance audits are quite common. And then equalization, directly and indirectly equalization. Equalization is where you want to be sure that the properties are equalized to a standard. And there the green is yes and the red is no. And you see that there are differences by the different states and by different localities. And then the indirect equalization is where the states can do studies, but cannot do anything in terms of direct equalization. Again, the yes being the green, the no, the red. And the next slides then are about technical advice, legal advice and technical assistance. And yes is green and no is red. You can see that legal advice is common in some places, but not everywhere. But you get into technical assistance and it's almost all green. And that technical assistance is that there's a lot of properties that are simply complex to assess. And you don't have the expertise at a local level to be able to come up with all the information you need to do a technical assessment on maybe a oil refinery or something of that type, which you may only have one of them in your jurisdiction. So the states basically collect the information and share it statewide so that on oil refineries or some other type of technical property, they're able to give good technical assistance. And this would help to do the valuation of railroads and oil lines and this type of thing. And the next set of slides are the number of properties in the state or province. And second, the personal property within the state or province. Now, you'll notice right off, in terms of personal property, Canada, for the most part, does not assess personal property, whereas a couple of provinces do, Ontario in particular. Personal property is more commonly assessed in many of the states, but not in all the states. In terms of real property count, there you can see that the number of properties, the largest number is in the red, and then going into the purples, and the lowest number is the blue and the greens. And this more or less kind of represents the part, the size of the state or province in terms of the number of properties and the way that they're managed. So you can see that in Canada, there's many a large number of properties. Those that are blank mean that there was no response given. So several states just didn't want to answer that question. You see that Texas and California and Florida all have very large numbers of parcels that are counted. And you see the differences in the states for the personal property. And then the chief assessment officers, this is kind of interesting because in Canada, 100% of the chief assessment officers are appointed, whereas in the United States, 43% are appointed and 57% are elected. So in the United States, a large number of the assessing officials are elected, whereas in Canada, they're all appointed, and in 43% of the United States, they're appointed. You can tell the difference because the blue are appointed and the red are elected. And those that are kind of different colors are somewhere in between, some appointed and some elected. So you can kind of tell from this that those elected are primarily on the western coast of the United States and the mid part of the United States. You notice that Florida, the Carolinas, and other places, many of them are appointed rather than being elected. So that shows you the difference. And it's a big difference in the United States. I know that I've always been in an appointed position. So there was a lot of states that I simply couldn't go to, although I did work in Sacramento County, but I was in an appointed deputy assessor position there, not an elected position. Now we're going to look at central versus local assessment practices by property type. And this is kind of interesting, starting with railroads and railroad cars. You can see that railroads are largely centrally assessed by the state governments, and centrally assessed is very common for the railroads everywhere. In terms of this is the railroad, the land and the tracks that they're on are central. And then you look at the railway cars. Basically, they're like the personal property. And again, you can see the differences by the states. Again, largely being centrally assessed for the most part. And you can see in that case, the green, they don't even assess them. So most of Canada is green, and some of the states are green. Oil refineries and pipelines. Centrally assessed are the purple or whatever color you call it. And the pipelines, you can see the pipelines are pretty much all centrally assessed, whereas the land and the tracks of the railways are pretty much individually done by the different states. Then telecommunication land and equipment. The telecommunication land centrally assessed through much of the United States. You notice that Ontario doesn't even assess telecommunications properties, nor does Pennsylvania. And then the equipment there, again, it kind of split up with the states kind of all doing different things, some being centrally assessed and others doing it in different ways, and a few where it's not even taxed. Farmland is kind of interest. Farmland, the blue there is locally assessed as real property just about everywhere. Then you get into farm equipment and you find out that it varies. Much of it is done at the local level, sometimes as personal property and sometimes as real property. But you see the differences from state to state on the farm equipment. And then talking about property exemptions, this is kind of interesting also. Religious exemption, red is exempt, and the oranger type or the yellow type is partially exempt. So basically religious properties are either partially exempt or fully exempt everywhere. A couple of states didn't respond. And then looking at charitable organizations, there again, most states have an exemption for them, but in Texas in particular, charitable organizations are fully taxed. It's kind of different than many of the other places. And then the other color is, the yellow is kind of for partial exemptions based upon some of the factors involved. And then this next chart is agriculture and timberland and orchards. And the yellow type is partially exempt and the green is fully taxable. So you can see that agricultural is, pretty much partially exempt or fully taxable, and you can see the differences there by state. In terms of the timberland and the orchards, the green is fully taxable and the yellow is partially exempt. So there again, for the most part, they're fully taxable or partially taxable. For some reason, the Yukon, they're fully exempt. And then looking at the oil and gas properties and the pipelines in place, or the minerals in place. The oil and gas property, the green is fully taxable. You can see that most of it is green. Partially exempt is the yellow, and many people did not even respond to that. And then the minerals in place, the red is fully exempt, the green is fully taxable, and the yellow partially exempt. So you can see the differences for minerals in place by the various states. Then we have machinery and business inventory. Business inventory is pretty much non-taxable everywhere. There's only a few places that really tax it. Texas in particular, it stands out as one. They're fully exempt. Most places were partially exempt. In terms of the machinery, the level of exemption for machinery and equipment, it varies quite a bit. The green is fully taxable, the yellow partially exempt, and the red fully exempt. So you can see quite a bit of difference in the states, and a large number of states didn't answer that question, which means that we need to have more information on those other states. Then cemetery and on the cemeteries, you would think that everyone would fully exempt cemeteries. But we see, for example, in Washington state, they're fully taxable. And in Pennsylvania, they're fully taxable. Everywhere else, they're either fully exempt or partially exempt. And then on the historic property, green is fully taxable, red is fully exempt, and yellow is partially exempt. And there's a lot of differences state by state there that you can see for this category. And then confidentiality and public records. Just on the first one, online by property number or address. 9 provinces responded, and all 9 of them have an online property number or address where you can find out your assessment. 26 of the states, of the 51 states, answered that there's online by number or address. And then online by interactive maps. Many of both the provinces and states, now you can go on a map and you can look for properties and find it that way. And then some shows the other differences. For example, in some cases, they have to be requested in writing. In other cases, all records are required to be accessible. And you can see kind of the differences here by the numbers involved. Property tax valuation and levy limits. And this is showing it over a period of years. I'm not able to read the 2017, but you can see that in Canada, there's very little in terms of statutory restrictions on levies or millage, which are more commonly found in the United States. I'm going to go to the next one because what's more common is property circuit breakers. And there are in Canada 2 provinces that have circuit breakers, and there are 25 and 32 states that have something. And then looking at the tax deferral program, this is probably the one that's most commonly used now for senior citizens that 22 of the states have age-required tax deferment programs. In Canada, there's 4 that have age available, and other ones such as disability and other requirements. Then we have partial value exemption for primary residence. This is something that's becoming more popular. It's not yet common. It's not found except in one province in Canada, but it's becoming quite common in the United States, particularly for disabled veterans. 28 states have provisions for age 21, for income 15, for occupancy 31, for value 4, and for disability 22, and for disabled veterans 28. And then we have another category, which is called payment in lieu of tax and economic incentive programs. Payment in lieu of tax is where an exempt agency like a church or like a university or a hospital agrees or is required to pay a tax, even though they're normally an exempt type organization. And looking at nonprofit hospitals and extended care facilities in Canada, 4 of the provinces have voluntary pilot projects and 2 have required. In the United States, 4 have voluntary, and I can't see the end as the total there. And you can see on churches that there's just 1 state that has a voluntary church where they pay their taxes. And public universities, there's 3 states that provide for that. Or, I'm sorry, 3 provinces and 2 states that provide for that. I know that this was becoming more popular in British Columbia. The assessment authority paid property taxes on all property that they rented or owned. And economic incentive programs are also becoming more popular, where the jurisdiction gives a corporation, either an abatement or some benefit to locate there because they want to see the tax base increased by having that company there. And you'll see that property tax abatements are now common in 4 Canadian provinces and 32 states. And general obligations bonds for capital improvements in 17 states, and personal property exemptions in 29 states, and green energy in 19 states, brownfield or containment property in 21 states, and enterprise or development zone credits in 16 states, and development zone exemptions in 19 states, and tax increment financing in 41 states, and 9 special service areas, and 20 open space. So then mandatory reassessment cycles and sales disclosures. This one is quite interesting because I told you that the whole problem with the land value tax is how often the property is reassessed and how much the tax rate is. And you can see here that in terms of doing reassessments annually, there's only of the total 51 states and 14 territories, there's only 12 of them that do annual reassessments. And there's another 5 that do it every 2 years, and another 7 that do it every 3 years, and another 5 that do it every 4 years, and about 8 that do it every 5 years. Everyone else does it either 6 years or later. And you see in color chart here by color who does it the most often, and you'll see that no requirement is green. Now, British Columbia was in green because they do it annually by requirement. It's not something, they answered the question that it's not something that is a required thing, it's done. So you can see the purple are the annual, and then that kind of orange are every 2 years, and the blue every 3 years, and the dark green every 4 years, and so forth. So you can see how much it varies by state. In California, of course, there's no requirement with Proposition 13 that gets reassessed only when the property is sold. So this is kind of a critical thing about the mandated reassessment cycles. And then sales disclosure is also important. That 9 of the 10 provinces in Canada and 29 of the 51 states have state property disclosures with locally assessed in others and locally assessed personal property statements. So final thoughts, the last slide is fewer Canadian provinces are taxing personal property. There's stability in staffing. We haven't seen staffing grow that much in recent years. And agencies are providing less legal advice. And agencies are providing more technical assistance and reference. There's now many green energy producers that are exempt or pay in lieu of taxes. And many indicate requirements for appeal board members. More and more now, appeal boards are becoming more professional. And many now have fees for getting public records. And my final slide is that this is Thomas Paine, and this is from Agrarian Justice. Men did not make the earth. It is the value of the improvements only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. From Agrarian Justice by Thomas Paine. So just in conclusion, then I'm concluding that land is the best source of public revenue. Land is the primary source of public revenue, and collecting land rent could reduce the taxes that are on wages and buildings and workers, producers, and enhance the wealth of all people. So I'll answer now questions on any of the subjects that were discussed this evening. And if you raise your hand, I'll call on you. I see Ed Dotson first, and you have to unmute yourself first.
Okay, Ted, one of the slides was titled Personal Property Parcels. And I was curious about that. Does that mean that those parcels were zoned for like manufactured housing units that wouldn't be permanently affixed to the slab, or what would a personal property parcel be?
Good question. Personal property basically, it not only includes the owner of the real estate, but it includes all the tenants on the real estate. So there could be an office building with 100 tenants in it, and each one of those tenants would file a statement about the personal property that they own, which is basically their desks and their computer equipment, all that kind of thing. So that the number of personal property accounts basically is reflecting the number of personal property accounts that have nothing to do with real estate accounts. They do not include the housing you were talking about. They include only what's categorized by the state as personal property. This is largely the machinery, equipment, and fixtures that people put into the rental space when they rent a space from an owner. Another question?
Tom Rossman.
Yes, good evening. Thanks. Another great presentation, Ted. My question is, since the Henry George approach on land is based on the amount of value that's created that is captured by private individuals and not the public. So the public's creating the value and all of that's going to stay in the private sector and the private individuals. Is there any assessment? Is there any estimation that you know of that kind of calculates this massive privatization of gains that are driven by the public?
It's the individual assessments that are the measure of the gain that that accrues to the state or to the property, the communities that are involved. And in terms of, are there other records? There could be records that are kept by building departments and so forth. So there could be any numbers of people that would be interested in making estimates to find out what is happening. Certainly states and counties would have records about the stated value of new construction and so forth going on. But it's the assessor who actually comes up with the market values that are added to the tax base. So that's the source of the taxation that is used.
Right. Okay. But my question is, maybe I didn't phrase it well. Basically, the rent seeking that takes place, the amount of value that's created for private individuals that is on the basis of the growth of the community and the public expenditure for infrastructure and roads and bridges and trains, et cetera. So is there any study that you know of that tries to quantify the amount of value that's captured by private individuals that's driven by the community?
I think that there have been a number of university professors. In fact, I know of 2 or 3 doctorate studies on this very subject that were done over the years, where they've tried to estimate what the value is, that private landowners kind of pocket. So the answer to your question is yes, but in terms of it being something that's done, all the time and published widely, the answer is no.
Is it possible that you could provide those names? Because that would be very helpful.
I'd have to look them up. I remember that Bill Trueheart is one in Los Angeles, California, but that's going way back. I don't know that I could find you the names. If I do find them, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead. Bill, I see his hand is up, so go ahead, Bill. You're muted. Muted, Bill. Unmute, Bill. Unmute, Bill.
Let me help you here.
Go
Go ahead, Bill. You should be able to unmute.
And unmute,
Bill
Bill.
is watching.
Unmute.
Yeah, now
Okay, can you hear me now?
yes.
Yes.
I have 4 questions, but I'll ask 2, and then if we have time, you can come back to me.
Okay.
The 2 questions I have, first, in New York State, you didn't mention power plants, but in New York State, power plants are assessed and taxed at the local level. And I'll give you one egregious case. In the town of Lansing, which is just north of Ithaca along Lake Cayuga, there is a big power plant, a coal power plant, which I think may now have been switched to natural gas. But what happens is because of that power plant, the people in Lansing, New York, have very, very low property taxes, and yet the town collects a huge amount of revenue, which they mainly use to build up their fire department. And that fire department has more fire trucks than most big cities because it becomes a hobby for lots of volunteer firemen to play with those toys. Now, you didn't mention power plants in your presentation. I assume that in many cases, maybe in states, the assessments are done at the state level and so is the taxes. I don't know about that. Before you answer that though, the second question, I'm very aware that in New Hampshire, the religious property around churches is limited to 1 acre. If you want any more, it's taxable. Now, in Colorado, a few years ago, the religious organizations started into the business of land speculation. They bought huge parcels of property because they were exempt, and then they speculated on them. I wonder whether any other state besides New Hampshire has a limitation on the amount of church-owned property that is exempt.
They're two very good questions. First, in terms of power plants, in my experience, in most cases, the power plants assessment are really based upon what the power plant declares their cost to be. I know they had 2 power plants in Connecticut, one in Hartford and one in Bridgeport that I had to assess. And we relied upon the actual cost that the power plant spent in building the power plant and in maintaining the power plant. And every year they would update the costs and every year they would spend a big chunk of money on improving them and adding on to them and so forth. So the assessors more or less relied upon the information the power plants gave them. And again, the power plant, the taxes were given just to that city they were located in, not to all the users statewide, but only to the jurisdiction it was located. That is, I think, pretty much true in terms of worldwide, that that there's not that much sharing of the taxes with all those users who who are using the electricity and so forth that the power plant uses. And then the second question.
Church-owned property.
Say that again.
On church-owned property.
Church-owned property, yes. I know in British Columbia, there was no limit of numbers of acres, but we would very carefully look at how the property was used. Certainly the church building and the parking lot and some reasonable landscaping would be exempt. But once we saw that they had a large chunk of land that was unused, that portion was paid full taxes. And we got full taxes on many churches that were speculating, basically. And in one case, we had a church, they would buy the sites with the whole idea of that they're going to resell it for a profit in the future. So I think that many states realize this, and that's why on that one map we showed that churches are in many states are fully exempt, but in many other states they're partially exempt. That's because the state looks for those speculators. Okay, another question from someone else.
Lars.
Yes, thank you. So my question was going to be about your position on 2 questions. Your position on property tax exemptions, which ones do you think are okay and which ones do you think are very damaging? And the other is, were you allowed to use property, like in states with non-disclosure laws, is the tax assessor allowed to look up stuff on Zillow, Redfin, and MLS, or is that not allowed?
Well, there's no limit about using Zillow and Redfin and the others, the assessors can use them, but typically they use them for background information or to answer specific questions or to find out things. They certainly don't base their assessments upon what Zillow thinks it's worth, but they do check those records occasionally, not all the time and not in a routine way, but more for an informative way. And your second question again was?
Which property exemptions do you think are okay and which ones do you think are particularly damaging?
Well, of course, my own view is that there should be no property exemptions. I mean, philosophically speaking, a property tax exemption, is giving a benefit. And I don't think I really don't think that benefit is needed. I think that state governments could afford to pay taxes on the property, the buildings they own. I think that churches could pay taxes on the buildings that they own. I think that all the others could pay taxes. So that's my kind of, off the cuff view of what I think. But in reality, I accept the fact that the public, and I have to respect the view of others in the public generally sees that many categories such as churches and certain types of exempt properties and certain other uses are due a property tax exemption. So I have my own view, and then I have the public view, and of course I have to represent the public view because an assessor has to follow what the laws are, and the laws pretty much provide for property assessments, and so you follow those laws. But again, when there's a question about a church speculating, we would go out and get them because our law, basically said that it was only the use of the church for religious purposes that could be exempt. And we included, of course, the parking lot and that kind of thing. Okay, next question.
Sue Walton.
Unmute yourself, Sue.
My question is regarding the state of Indiana. It appears from the chart that it's mandated every 4 years for property. But in my own county, I live in the county of Hendricks, which is just to the west of Marion County, which is in Indianapolis. I know for a fact that we are reassessed every year. Now, this may be a voluntary situation by our county, but I have seen in the time we have lived here that my value has gone up in my assessment. And we actually talked to our local county assessor who explained that she and her staff are out in the field almost every day checking property values and watching for sales because we are in a booming area. So it's more of a comment. Do you think that doing this every year is probably the best way to do and can get more income for a municipality, county? I know that Indiana is quite conservative in we will give back money if it over collects and things.
Okay, you've kind of answered your own question. The requirements of doing it every 2 or 4 years are requirements. An assessor could revalue every year if they wanted to. And I know that in Connecticut, we had a 5-year requirement, but oftentimes we would revalue after 3 or 4 years rather than waiting 5 years. The other thing is that assessors annually always pick up any new construction or any changes in the property. And they also pick up, simply seeing things that they missed or that were not taken out as permits, but were things that were added on by the people. So the assessor is free to raise the property assessments whenever they want to, whenever they see that there's a change that has to be reflected. But the requirements are that it has to be done at least every so often. And so I think in Indiana, at least where you live, you've got some good assessors that are out doing their job properly. And this is true, I think, pretty much throughout the country. Assessors do seek to get as much as possible so that everyone is being fairly assessed and fairly taxed. And ideally, if every assessor could do it every year, we'd have the best assessment system possible, and it would facilitate having a land value tax that would keep growing and growing. Another question.
Josh. Thank you very much. My questions are building up after a couple of weeks, so I want to sort of break the log jam. Ted, you talked about, thank you very much. This has been great. When states equalize property taxes from county to county or city to city, like New York City does, or New York State does, or Pennsylvania does, can that sort of broad brush distort equity in assessments? In other words, say Philadelphia provides this information and the state says, yes, that's equalized to 100% of market value, but different neighborhoods can different neighborhoods or areas be treated very differently, especially socioeconomic divisions like rich and poor, black and white?
Yes, I guess to answer the question, the whole purpose of equalization is to do away with the disparities. The idea being is that you're trying to equalize to a common base, which is market value, and that the market value would reflect the differences due to, for example, a good neighborhood that's growing compared to a bad neighborhood with problems and so forth. The other thing you have is that if the equalization can also be taken to court, if it was felt like the equalization was unfair to a group of property owners, maybe because of something that the equalization process missed, they can go to court and they can sue to have that corrected.
Okay, according to state law in Pennsylvania, a city presents its information, its assessed information, or a county, I should have said Philadelphia County, and the state has to take it as a whole, as an aggregate. And so they can't, by law, dig down into, areas that are, poor or rich or whatever, or areas where there are lots of sales. And that seems to be a real problem, especially in Pennsylvania, because a poor area can be included in the wonderful equalization information, but it doesn't reflect the true value.
So it depends upon the laws in the state and the jurisdiction. I had an experience in 1970 where I was the assessor of Hartford, Connecticut. And as a result of my assessments that were completed in 73, the Black northern part of the city had a dramatic decrease in property values. And the white southern part of the city had a dramatic increase in property values. And I got called to the city attorney's office to tell me that the city council could not accept the changes that I was proposing to make, to take taxes off of the Black people and add it to the white people. And
I bet you did. Yeah.
That was when I decided to look for another job. And that was when I went to British Columbia as a consultant, because I could not live in a city that would treat Black people differently than white people. And basically,
that answers my question. And again, I could let my questions build up into the next lesson, so I'll back off. But thank you so much.
Okay. Another question from someone.
Adam.
Hi, thanks for the lecture, Ted. Can I ask where you stand on the position of how rights of way should be taxed, and should they be tax exempt because the rent is reflected in the adjacent parcels that they serve, or should they be taxed at the level of development of the adjacent parcels that they serve, or just done strictly on a mileage basis by by state government.
Okay, to answer that question, there's two classes of right of way that I'm thinking of. One of them would be like railroad right of ways that go across the whole state. And there, the right of way has a greater value because it goes across the whole state. And that's kind of assessed through a state function to that property owner. Then there's other right of ways that may just affect a couple of parcels of land that are adjacent to one another. And those are generally then assessed to the benefiting parcel, the one that is benefiting from the right of way adjacent to it. So I think that it requires kind of thinking about the differences and also looking at the state laws that may have some impact on it.
Right. The reason I asked, we lost a fairly significant amount of railroad mileage in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s. And decades later, when the market recovered, the rights of way were not always available to put the tracks back. And part of the reason why we lost rights of way or we went from double track to single track was they were trying to save taxes. And is there anything is there like a philosophical benefit that maybe we should think of a way to, preserve these things, in case we need them again in future?
Well, yes, ideally, we should be able to preserve it and utilize it. And, we have lots of right of ways, like on highways and so forth, that are becoming more valuable as time goes on, just because they do cut through whole areas and allow further improvement to the roads and so forth. So it's kind of a philosophical question. I mean, I'm all for keeping right of ways in place when possible. I'm talking about transportation right of ways in particular. I know here in Los Angeles, we have the red car system. And in those cases, many of those right of ways were kept, but in a few cases, they were destroyed and buildings were built on them so that they couldn't be used. But many of them were kept and then were used for a new rail system in Los Angeles. Another question?
Marty Roland.
Yeah, Ted, it was a great class. I got 4 comments or questions, and so let me just go through them. Responding to what Tom Rossman was getting at, I think he was suggesting, or maybe a solution to what he was asking for, is identifying and providing a map where the potential for Georgia's to declare some wins would be a map that showed where the biggest revenue sources are out there to be gotten if we, had a, let's say, a game plan, let's say. So if we knew where the biggest bang for the buck is, then we could set our agenda. But I'm just speaking out loud for Tom, but I think that's where he was going at. The next one had to do with the religion, and I think a lot of people are aware that with the Catholic Church having billions of dollars worth of settlement on sexual abuse, it is notable that they use the land value in Manhattan to pay off a lot of the claims. So in a sense, all of us were paying for the victims of the Catholic priests, which is kind of an interesting thing. I did have a question about the IAAO. It seems like that would be an excellent organization to come up with best practices. Is that something that IAAO does? And my last one had to do with, is Alaska really as big as it looked like on that map?
The map question is that looking at a globe, it's not going to be as big on the globe as it looks like on that map, and that is
okay.
just assertion in the map.
Okay.
So the IAAO, they are a professional organization that are really interested in doing exactly what you're suggesting, improving assessments everywhere and doing the best job possible in coming up with policies and recommendations. And there are a number of assessors that are good land value taxers. They understand the importance of raising revenue from land, and they do an outstanding job about collecting the revenue by making a point of being sure that they're getting all the revenue from the land that they can. So the IAAO is a spokesman that we really should utilize because they are interested basically in good assessments, and that's what we're interested in also. And we can work together to see that happen. And they do have models, they have manuals, and they have conferences every year. The Lincoln Institute for the last 25 years has had a major segment at their conferences talking about improving assessment practices. And they're now well recognized as one organization that's advocating for raising revenue, more revenue from land and public purposes. So to answer that question, yes, the IAAO should be utilized and we should be supporting them. And they at least are not opposed to what we want, which is to capture as much revenue from land as we can.
Yeah. So in terms of the people of New York City paying the victims of sexual abuse of the Catholic Church by being tax exempt and then flipping around and selling your land seems like it's kind of unethical.
Yep. I personally agree with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Another question?
Yanis,
Yes, I wanted first to ask to piggyback on Bill's question about the power plants, because there the power plant assessment looks like that all the methods you have mentioned would not apply there, because the land around the power plant is already depressed because of the noise, radiation, pollution, contamination. So my question is, how are power plants land value assessed? Like, do they ascribe it the same depressed value that is around in the comparable and the adjacent land to the power plant? To me, that doesn't look right. And do we have an example of how would it work to find out the land value of a power plant?
Giannis, I always have a hard time understanding exactly what your point is, but
I can, Ted, I can, it's about how you assess land value of a power plant. And the question is because land around the power plant is naturally depressed because of pollution, contamination, radiation, and what have you. So if you use the models that you mentioned today, it looks like the power plant would be benefiting from a lower assessment because they themselves do the depreciation of the land. And that sounds like a vicious circle. I don't know if you understand what my point is.
I understand your question. To answer your question, property adjacent to a power line oftentimes loses value because of the nuisance of that power line being there. People don't want to live in a house under a power line.
exactly.
So it has negative effects upon adjacent properties, but still that power line, the stretch of right of way that it has going across a large area has enhanced value that's more valuable than the adjacent land because it can send power for this long distance.
Mhm.
So the power company is benefiting, from an enhanced value, but depressing the property around it.
That's a
Wayne Looney, do you have a question?
So how would you remedy this contradiction?
Yanni, hold on. Wayne, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a comment about that projection of the size of Alaska. That map there was a Mercator projection, which is designed to have all equal distance between the meridians of longitude all the way to the poles. And of course, as you get closer to the poles, you get more and more distortion. But there are other optional projections which can show a more honest equal area, but then they distort the shapes of the continents. It's just a basic problem with the trying to put the surface of a sphere on a flat surface. It's inherent. That's all.
So do we have time for another question?
Is that a comment or a question?
No, I think.
Okay.
It was a comment.
Let's give the last word to Joe. Joe Polito.
Unmute yourself, Joe.
Hi, great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Just one quick question. Do you have a suggestion as how we could adapt George's thought to the banks? Mariana Mazzucato, remarkable economist who wrote The Value of Everything and other popular books, has said that the banking industry is a rentier institution. So I wondered if you'd given that any thought. Thank you.
Well, in terms of property values, we're assessing the land and the buildings, the physical assets. And you're now talking about taking an assessment of beyond the physical assets into monopoly assets, for example. And currently that's not within the ability of the assessor to do that. I think that those are ideas that Georges may want to think about and may want to incorporate in George's thinking. I know that we had several people at the Schockenbach Foundation that were very interested in the value of monopolies and assessing the values of monopolies, but nothing has been done to allow that to happen yet. Okay, I think that's it.
Yes, that's it. I see Tom Rossman raising his hand. Was that before Tom, or do you have a new point to make? So we're gonna just.
Yeah, no, that was actually from before.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
So anyway, it's 8:03. It's very interesting, very exciting presentation, but that's all we have time for. So we look forward to seeing you next week for session 3.
Okay.